We dare to dream of an island of equals. It's a book bursting with anecdotes, songs, poems, revelations, and reminiscences. But it's also an important book about important times. At one level, it's the story of the Geraghties, a close-knit family growing up in the Liberties in hard times. And the hero of this story is Lily O'Neill, Des's mother, who as a teenager pushes a pram to pick up newspapers from Western Row Station for her mother to sell at her newspaper stand outside the ballast office. Sometimes, Des recounts, that pram might carry the odd revolver or pistol. During the War of Independence, Lily was a member of Clan McGael Scouts. But it was her brother Jack who opened her mind to the socialist writings of James Connolly and indeed of Karl Marx. Jack O'Neill was a radical leader of the unemployed who, along with the writer Liam O'Flaherty, occupied the Rotunda Concert Hall and raised the red flag in the early days of the Civil War. Theirs was a failed uprising, but Jack had a profound influence on his sister's way of thinking, and she in turn passed on her passion for justice and for inquiry to her 5 sons.
She was a very formidable woman. She was very, very tough defending her family, and if anyone said anything wrong about it, she would deal with it. She wasn't afraid of the police, she wasn't afraid of bousies, and she wasn't afraid of employers. I remember one occasion as a child standing beside my mother when my father had lost his job and was unemployed, and we were living in the building owned by the employer, and there was a rumour that we would be evicted from the house, and my mother physically put her hand on the tie, the Trinity College tie of the employer's son, and said, your bootlaces won't be found around here if you try to evict the Geraghty family.
And your father, Des, what was he like?
My father was a quiet-spoken, hard, tough man, but he was full of history and knowledge, and he taught us to walk the city. He showed us where all of the events took place, and he imbued a great sense of curiosity and interest. So they had very little education, but they loved books, and I tried to deal with that in the book as well. They taught us all to read. I think we all read before we went to school. Reading was a big thing in our family. Books were always there from all parts of the world. Local books, history books, stories. And so they did imbue that sense of exploration and reading.
Yeah, it's worth Des maybe telling that story about the priest coming, because it's a wonderful story.
Well, he basically said, when he was waiting on my mother, who was trying to clean herself up because of a surprise visit, he said, Mrs. Geraghty, do you realise an awful lot of these books are banned? I asked him, my mother said I wouldn't be bothered about that. Everyone in this house reads. And he said, no, but they're banned by the church. You shouldn't be reading them. She said, rather than reading that and causing trouble out on the streets. And so this conversation went on for a while. And eventually I think my mother got fed up with this, the attitude, the supercilious attitude. She said, I think, Father, you might have come into the wrong house.
But it's also a book that describes a part of our history which is too often overshadowed by the nationalist narrative. It's a history about class, and about class warfare and struggle in its many forms.
Well, I suppose we weren't much different from most families at the time. We were struggling hard times, and so I felt throughout this book I should develop this team of the ordinary people who are often unnamed and unnoticed, but they're there, and it's their heart and soul that's put into change in society. That's the strength of the ordinary people of this country, and I try to reflect that in this story. It's not a hard history book. I try to make it readable and understandable, and people would feel an identity with the family growing up.
This was a time of poverty and emigration, and that certainly affected the Geraghty family along with many other families. But at another level, this is a story about a generation growing up in a newly independent Ireland, a generation that had to struggle to use its muscle, and when it did, it changed this country for the better.
probably the strongest spiritual influence in our house wasn't popes or clergy, but it was Jim Larkin. There was that kind of, it was just accepted that Larkin was the man my parents looked up to, the man that we learned about very early on in life. Larkinism was really the upsurge of the courage and the spirit of the poor people who were trodden down. And in the event of the Civil War, a lot of the Republicans were died, the people who had actually fought from 16 right through to 22 and 23, and the people who took over were the Sinn Féin leaders, who were the same people who would have thought to smash Connolly and Larkin early on. So we had learned all that as our history from at home, and I think that spirit permeated the whole family, because for one reason or other, and it wasn't planned, every one of us ended up working for some trade union or other. We spent our lives at it, as well as getting involved in various politics. We were never all the same. We were very different personalities, very different temperaments. But we were all attracted, I think, of the concept of an injury to one is the concern of all. And I think that's a kind of universal theme that unites the human race. And it starts at home, it starts in the local, and it starts in the trade union movement, where people stand up for their fellows, or their brothers or sisters. And the people who are most badly treated get the support from their colleagues. And that's the essence of trade unionism. That was Larkinism.
It is worth, I think, taking a minute to remind ourselves of the brothers, and also, I suppose, to touch on a point. All of you, I think, you all marched in the one direction, but to the sound of different drums occasionally. Was Christmas dinner an interesting time in the Geraghty household?
No, we always got on. Yeah, whatever our differences, we always managed to bury them and come together. And we didn't like anyone saying anything bad about any of our brothers, no matter what we said about them. And my mother was a bit like that. We could have our arguments among ourselves, but if anyone outside attacked us, then we would be into the defence. And I always remembered having the backup of my brothers when I was at school. Rough times very often, but in the schoolyard where there could be some bullies, it was just nice to have 4 other brothers that could back you up when you got into trouble. So we always had that. I found that all in my life, and even in the trade union movement. My brother Tom was still alive, and I hope he's looking in there. He was always a great support. He was there, and he was fighting the same old cause as we were fighting. He was in a different union, but eventually the unions amalgamated. And I think part of the rationale of that was that people begin to realise that the old differences didn't really matter. We've got to face the common issues, the common interests together. And that coming together was very important for me. When I was an officer of the union, Tom was a member of the executive. And that coming together of the old Larkins Union and the old Transport Union, where the dispute had split their movement for about 50 years, that was a very important development. And indeed, it leads on to something I deal with in the book as well, and I hope people will take note of. I'm pointing out why we got into national bargaining. People talk about national partnership. I never call it national partnership. I call it national bargaining, where we brought workers to the table of ministers, governments, before budgets and after budgets. And we made sure that they were heard and that the issues affecting ordinary people, from tax, social welfare, education, investment. And I was very proud on the last negotiation that I led myself for a national agreement on behalf of our union. We actually negotiated 10,000 affordable homes to be provided by the state. Not mentioned, the trade union movement actually negotiated around the table for the state to put money into housing when it wasn't being done. And so many good memories of all of my brothers. Shay had great characteristics as well. He knew more about Dublin than anyone else I ever met in my life. He knew every street, every house. He could tell you the history of it. My brother Hugh wrote a remarkable history of William Partridge, which is noted by the research that was done. He was an unseen man in history as well, but he was very much in the Citizen Army, a very important man. And Sean was famous. He became very famous in London. He became famous in Northern Ireland at one time as well, but he became famous in London. And he was reputed to be referred to by Thatcher as the most dangerous man in England. And because he brought all the newspapers to a stop in England, and no one else could do it, in support of the nurses who were out on strike in England. So that's a bit of a story there as well.
Des is eloquent too about the importance of culture and of traditional music in his life. He pays tribute to the many musicians who kept the flame alive during hard times. heart, this book is about an extraordinary family who have contributed so much to making Ireland a better place. The preface of the book begins, "Our family consisted of two hard-working parents, Tom and Lily, plus 5 hardy boys, Sean, Tom, Séamus, Desmond, and Hugh. All were well nourished on potatoes, porridge, native pride, and a strong sprinkling of rebellion." I think in this book, Des has done his family proud.
Oh, Lily bright, oh, Lily fair, young Lily of the streeling hair, so wan you look in the grey cold air, selling the morning papers. Childhood days have flown away, the streets for you are school each day, chasing pence, the game you play, for the men have all gone marching, marching to the drums of war, echoing loudly near and far, while brave young hearts are beating.